The Mustang stood motionless, its body trembling with exhaustion. The thick rope dug into its neck, keeping it tethered to the tree, unable to run. Its once proud coat was dull and matted, its ribs pressing against its skin. Its breath was shallow. It was weak, sick, and abandoned. The man who had led it here was gone. He hadn't looked back. He hadn't hesitated. He had tied the knot, patted the horse's neck like he was saying goodbye, and walked away without a second thought. He knew what would come next. He knew the wolves would find it. And he didn't care. Silence filled the air, the kind of silence that creeps into the soul, warning of something unseen. The Mustang flicked its ears, sensing danger. The wind carried an unmistakable scent, one that sent shivers down its frail body. Predators. Then a rustle in the bushes, a flicker of movement in the distance. Yellow eyes, glowing like embers in the fading light of day. The pack had arrived. The wolves moved slowly, their padded paws barely making a sound on the forest floor. There were 5 of them, maybe 6, their fur bristling with hunger. They had been tracking the scent of weakness, and now they had found their prey. The Mustang tried to move, but the rope was too tight. Panic surged through its veins, but it was too weak to fight. It let out a low, desperate sound, not a whinny, not a cry, just a sound of defeat. The wolves circled closer. One stepped forward, baring its teeth, lips curled back in a silent snarl. It was only a matter of time now. The horse closed its eyes. But then, something happened. Something no one expected. A loud snap echoed through the trees. The wolves froze. Their ears perked. They turned their heads sharply, looking beyond the Mustang, deeper into the woods. Something was coming. The Mustang opened its eyes, its breath quickening. It heard it too. Hoofbeats. At first it was faint, distant, like an illusion. But then it grew louder. The sound of pounding hooves, racing through the forest, shaking the earth beneath them. The wolves backed away, uncertain, their hunger momentarily replaced by caution. And then, through the trees they emerged. A herd. Wild, untamed, powerful. At least a dozen Mustangs galloped forward, their manes flying in the wind, their eyes fierce and full of life. They were not running away from danger. They were charging toward it. The lead stallion, a massive black Mustang with a scar across its face, let out a shrill, commanding cry. The wolves hesitated. This was not prey. This was a force of nature. The stallion reared up, striking the air with its hooves. The others followed, forming a protective circle around the sick Mustang. The wolves knew better than to challenge a herd. They snarled but slowly backed away, disappearing into the shadows of the forest. The Mustang stood there, breathing heavily, still tied, still weak, but no longer alone. The stallion stepped forward, lowering its head, pressing its muzzle against the sick horse as if to say, "You are one of us." And then, another sound. A different sound. Footsteps. The man had returned. He had left the horse to die, but something had made him turn back. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was fate. But what he saw when he arrived made him stop dead in his tracks. The Mustang he had abandoned was not alone. It was surrounded by its kind, protected, accepted. It was no longer weak. It was no longer a victim. It had become something else, something powerful, something untouchable. For the first time the man felt fear. Not of the wolves, not of the wild, but of what he had done. He had underestimated the spirit of the Mustang. And as he took a step closer, the lead stallion turned its head sharply, locking eyes with him. A silent warning. You do not belong here. The man hesitated. Then slowly he lowered his gaze, turned and walked away. He had come to witness the end of a story. Instead he had witnessed a miracle. And the Mustang? It stood there, watching him go before finally turning its head to the herd, the rope still hanging loosely around its neck. But it didn't matter anymore. Because now it was free. The Mustang stood amidst its newfound protectors, breathing heavily, its frail body barely able to hold itself up. The herd surrounded it, their eyes flickering with a silent understanding. The lead stallion, a towering black beast with scars that told a story of battles long fought, stepped forward. His dark eyes studied the weakened Mustang, assessing its condition, deciding its fate. A gust of wind swept through the clearing, rustling the leaves and sending a shiver through the Mustang's thin frame. The rope still clung tightly around its neck, a reminder of its captivity, of the betrayal it had suffered. The other horses sniffed at it, nudging the rope with their muzzles. The stallion snorted, his breath visible in the cool morning air. Then, with a sudden and powerful motion, he reared up on his hind legs and brought his hooves crashing down onto the rope. The fibers strained, frayed and finally snapped. The Mustang staggered backward, free at last, yet too weak to stand on its own. The stallion let out a sharp call and two Maras approached. They pressed against the sick Mustang, supporting its weight, urging it to move. The herd would not leave one of their own behind. The wolves watched from the shadows, their glowing eyes flickering between curiosity and hunger. They were opportunists, waiting for the herd to leave, waiting for the sick Mustang to collapse. But the stallion knew better. He turned toward the predators and stomped the ground, letting out a deep, guttural sound that carried through the forest. The message was clear. Stay back or face the wrath of the herd. The wolves hesitated, then slowly slunk away into the darkness. The Mustang's legs trembled as it took a slow, painful step. Then another. The herd moved with it, matching its pace, ensuring it was never left behind. They traveled together, deeper into the forest, away from the place of betrayal, away from the memories of the rope and the man who had abandoned it. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher in the sky, casting golden rays through the trees. The Mustang's steps grew steadier, its breathing less labored. It still bore the weight of sickness, but something inside it had changed. It was no longer just a sick horse waiting for the end. It was a survivor. And then the world opened up before them. The trees parted, revealing a vast, endless plain bathed in sunlight. Rolling hills stretched into the horizon, their golden grass swaying in the wind. Wildflowers dotted the landscape, painting the earth with splashes of red, yellow, and blue. A river snaked its way through the valley, its waters glistening under the bright sky. The Mustang took a shaky step forward and felt the warmth of the sun on its back. The open land called to it, whispering promises of freedom, of second chances. The stallion stepped beside it, his presence strong and commanding. He let out a low, encouraging sound. "This is your home now." The herd erupted into motion, their hooves pounding against the earth as they galloped toward the open fields. The Mustang watched them for a moment, feeling the fire of life reignite in its chest. Then, with every ounce of strength it had left, it pushed off the ground and ran. Its legs screamed in protest, its lungs burned, but it ran. It ran like it had never run before. And as the wind rushed past, as the golden plains stretched endlessly ahead, the Mustang felt something it had not felt in a long time. It felt free. But back in the forest, the man was not free. He sat by the dying embers of his fire, staring into the flames, haunted by what he had seen. When he had tied the horse to that tree, he had believed he was writing the final chapter of its story. He had believed that nature would take its course, that the wolves would finish what time had already begun. But he had been wrong. The Mustang had not died. It had been saved. Not by him, not by human hands, but by something greater. The herd had come for it. They had seen its suffering and chosen to help. And that was something he could not understand. For years he had believed that weakness had no place in the world. That the sick and the slow were left behind, that only the strong survived. But the Mustangs had proven him wrong. They had risked their own safety for one of their own. They had chosen loyalty over convenience, compassion over cruelty. And that realization unsettled him. He looked down at his hands, rough and calloused from years of hard labor. He had spent his life breaking horses, taming them, forcing them into submission. He had seen them as tools, nothing more. But now he wondered if he had been the one who was broken all along. The wolves howled in the distance, their eerie cries echoing through the night. The man shivered. He no longer feared them. He feared himself. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he had been living the right way. And that thought terrified him more than anything. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the air. He exhaled, watching the embers drift upward, disappearing into the dark sky. Then slowly he stood. He gathered his things, strapped on his saddle, and turned toward the plains. Maybe he would never see that Mustang again. But maybe, just maybe, he would try to find it. Not to take it back. Not to own it. But to understand. The man rode through the darkened plains, his mind a storm of thoughts. The full moon cast a silver glow over the landscape, illuminating the rolling hills and the river that wound through them like a gleaming serpent. Somewhere out there, the Mustang ran free with its new herd. He could still see the moment in his mind, the way the stallion had shattered the rope, the way the weak horse had been supported instead of abandoned. He had spent his life believing that only the strong thrived. That to survive, one had to fight, conquer, dominate. He had never considered that survival could also mean loyalty, that strength could be found in unity. The wolves had watched, waiting for their moment to strike. And yet it never came. The Mustangs had defied nature's brutal laws, had rewritten the script of the weak being preyed upon. And now, for the first time, he questioned everything he had known. His horse whinnied beneath him, sensing his unrest. He reached down, patting its neck, feeling the warmth of the living creature beneath him. This horse had carried him for years, through dust storms, through rivers, through endless miles of open land. Had he ever once truly appreciated it? Or had he, like with everything else, simply seen it as a means to an end? The thought unsettled him. Morning crept over the horizon in a slow, golden glow. The sky, once black, now melted into shades of deep purple and soft orange. The grass glistened with dew, and the scent of wildflowers filled the air. Then he saw them. Far in the distance, a dark blur of movement. The herd. His heart pounded. Would they recognize him? Would they flee? Would the Mustang still be with them, or had it succumbed to its sickness after all? He nudged his horse forward, but cautiously. He didn't want to startle them. He didn't want to be seen as a threat. As he approached, the Mustangs lifted their heads, ears flicking. Their eyes locked onto him, untrusting, wary. Then the lead stallion stepped forward. The same black beast with scars like war medals, the one who had broken the rope. The man stopped. He dismounted, his boots crunching against the grass. He knew better than to approach recklessly. The stallion would not tolerate foolishness. The Mustang he had abandoned stood among them. It was still thin, still weak, but no longer broken. Its coat, once dull with sickness, now held a slight sheen. It wasn't fully healed, but it was healing. And it was free. The stallion snorted, pawing at the earth. A warning. The man raised his hands. He wasn't here to fight. He wasn't here to take. He was here because he didn't know where else to be. For the first time in his life, he had nothing to claim, nothing to conquer. He simply wanted to understand. The Mustang met his eyes, and something passed between them. A silent acknowledgement. A recognition of the past. A question of the future. The stallion huffed and turned away, leading the herd in a slow walk across the plains. The Mustang hesitated, glancing once more at the man, then followed. The man watched them go, his heart heavy yet strangely light. He had come searching for something. And though he hadn't found an answer, he had found something even more valuable. A reason to change. He mounted his horse once more, turning toward the horizon. There was a long road ahead of him. A life left to unlearn. But maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to start over. The man sat in the saddle, watching the herd disappear into the horizon, their silhouettes blending into the golden light of dawn. His fingers tightened around the reins as an unfamiliar feeling washed over him. Guilt. Regret. And something deeper, an ache he couldn't quite name. For years he had lived by a simple code: survival of the fittest. He had tamed wild horses by breaking their spirits, forcing them into submission, bending them to his will. He had never stopped to wonder what they felt. But now he knew. The Mustang had not been saved by luck. It had been saved by something stronger than the cruelty of man, stronger than the hunger of wolves. It had been saved by its own kind. And the man? He had no kind. He pulled his horse's reins, turning away from the plains, but his heart remained behind. Days passed. The sun had barely begun its ascent when the man reached his cabin, a small wooden structure nestled against the edge of a dense pine forest. It was built for function, not comfort. Just 4 walls, a roof, and a fireplace. It had always been enough. But now, as he dismounted and stepped onto the porch, he felt the weight of silence pressing against him. For the first time, the emptiness unsettled him. The memories of the Mustang haunted him. The way it had struggled, the way it had been abandoned. And yet, it had been given a second chance. A chance he had denied it. He threw his saddle onto the railing and sat on the porch steps, staring into the distance. The vast land stretched before him, untouched, wild, free. He wanted to go back. But what could he say? He was just a man who had done wrong, and there was no changing that. Or was there? A plan. A week passed before he finally made his decision. He packed a small bag, loaded his saddle, and set off toward the plains where the Mustangs roamed. He didn't plan to take the Mustang back. He just wanted to see it again. To see if it had truly found its place among the wild. As he rode, his thoughts drifted back to the past. He had once been a boy, full of dreams, before the world had hardened him. Before life had taught him that kindness was weakness, that compassion was a liability. Maybe that had never been true. Maybe he had been blind all along. The return. The plains stretched before him, golden and endless. He scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of the herd. Hours passed and doubt crept in. Had they moved on? Had the Mustang been left behind after all? Then, in the distance, he saw them. A cluster of dark shapes grazing near a river. His heart pounded. The Mustang was there. It looked stronger now. Its coat had regained its luster, its ribs were no longer as visible. It still bore the scars of its past, but it stood proudly among the others, no longer an outcast. A strange relief washed over him. But he wasn't the only one who had noticed the threat. Something lurked at the edge of the trees, a shadow shifting between the trunks. The man narrowed his eyes. Wolves. A pack of them. He could see them now, slinking low to the ground, their eyes locked onto the herd. Unlike before, they weren't just waiting. They were hunting. The man's breath caught. The Mustangs had saved the sick horse from abandonment, but could they save it from the ruthless laws of nature? His instincts screamed for him to turn away. It wasn't his fight. The Mustangs would either survive or they wouldn't. But something in him refused to move. He reached for his rifle. Not to kill the wolves. He had no interest in slaughtering them. But he could give the Mustangs a fighting chance. The standoff. The lead stallion noticed the wolves first. His ears flattened, his muscles tensed, and he let out a sharp warning call. The herd immediately responded, shifting closer together, forming a defensive circle. The Mustang, the one he had once abandoned, stood among them, its head held high. The wolves crept closer, teeth bared, their hunger evident. The man lifted his rifle, aiming toward the sky. A single gunshot cracked through the air. The wolves halted, their heads snapping toward the sound. The stallion took his chance. He charged. With a powerful surge, the entire herd followed, thundering toward the predators with wild, untamed fury. The wolves hesitated for a moment too long. They had expected prey. They had not expected warriors. With a final snarl, the pack turned tail and vanished into the trees. Silence settled over the plains. The Mustangs stood tall, their sides heaving from the effort, but they were victorious. The man lowered his rifle. Then, as if sensing his presence, the Mustang turned toward him. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. Then, the Mustang did something that made his breath catch. It took a step toward him. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was acknowledgement. And then, just as quickly, it turned and galloped away, joining its herd as they disappeared into the horizon. The man's decision. The man stood there long after the Mustangs had gone, his heart heavy yet lighter than it had ever been. He had spent his life breaking wild horses, but today he had saved one. And maybe, just maybe, it had saved him too. With one last look at the plains, he turned back toward home. But this time he knew. He wasn't the same man who had left. And he never would be again.